Okay, so I feel like I should be walking around like Oprah or something. All right, can you talk a little bit more? I know you've all kind of addressed this a little bit, but talk about more specifically the ways that ethnic studies informs your work, the way that you apply the concepts and methodologies associated with ethnic studies, and how does that figure into your work, whether it's in film, whether it's in your community work, whether it's in your scholarship, and can you just comment on that?
All right, we'll go backwards this time. So for me, wow, this is gonna be kind of, I'm different because I'm an artist, so it's a little bit of a different approach from all the rest of the academics. I mean, and as I said earlier, like a lot of my films, how ethnic studies has helped me in most of my stories since graduation or in everything I do is that it helped bring a sense of reality to that world. I mean, I tell very personal stories. Shucks, I want to show an example of my TV show. We just did a food travel show, just briefly. It's a lot of my films coming out of grad school and in undergraduate was very heavy. Like it was the ku'e type of storytelling, and in which, you know, and that helps tell a story. And then when I went into LA, you know, I learned to kind of pull back a little bit and learn to figure out what's the best way to get our stories out there. Or just, because if I can, you know, you can always tell a story, but if no one's gonna watch it, then it didn't exist. Like it's like your voice wasn't heard. So since then, you know, I've kind of balanced a bunch of different things. I have a bunch of friends that I get together with. We call ourselves Those Damn Natives. We do like comedy stuff because it's like, it's for the YouTube generation, so it's for those kids to kind of watch, and we still have our messages in it, but then there's playful banter in it. And so one of my projects is it's the food travel show, which is straight up mainstream. That's what's the biggest thing in TV today. It's called Family Ingredients. So the basic idea is that how I diverse the communities here in Hawaii, Hawaiian, Filipino, Chinese, Japanese. We have our host. Our host, his name is Ed Kenny. His father is Ed Kenny Sr., the musician. His mother is Beverly Noah, the hula dancer, and he's a chef. Extremely knowledgeable, activist, chef. And so we find a family, we find their dish, that they remember growing up eating, loving, and we trace it back to their homeland and see what makes that dish so unique. And the whole idea of the show is that when you share your meal with someone, you not only share a piece of yourself, you share your culture, you share your family, you share everything that makes you. And so yeah, so that's kind of basically the pitch.
I'm Chef Ed Kenny. On Family Ingredients, we go on incredibly delicious adventures. We dive into family stories from past to present and farm to fork.
The way my grandfather grew up here in Tautira, you know, they lived off the land. He was a farmer and a fisherman. Wasam Kru, to me, is the quintessential Tahitian dish.
So yeah, so that's a TV series that we're developing right now. We've already filmed 4 of our 8 episodes. It got picked up, so we made the first pilot show a year ago, maybe almost 2 years ago. It got picked up by PBS National, so it was the first locally produced TV show that's going national, which kind of blew my mind, that we've been at this for a long time, and only now we finally have something that's finally accepted, I don't know, to the national audience. But so some of the places that we're visiting, you know, is Japan, Korea, China, Tahiti, Okinawa, Puerto Rico, and you know, in all of these stories, it's just kind of, I can't help it, but it's just pretty much ethnic studies stories. Where, our Okinawan story is we're going back with Hisai Uki. Her family them owns Sun Noodles. They're the only noodle factory that creates Okinawan soba. We're going back to Okinawa in order for us to tell the story of the pigs from the sea that after World War II, when their whole pretty much the livestock in Okinawa was gone, and these people, Okinawans in Hawaii, bought 500 pigs and shipped it over there with the help of the American military to help revitalize that community. And you know, and it's a food travel show, so it's like it allows us to tell those heavy stories with that fun food travel. Our other one is we're going to Puerto Rico. It's the Hernandez family. They're actually from New York, first generation. They moved to Hawaii because they loved Elvis. The father loved Elvis. The mother was actually Filipino, and so she learned how to make ganduli rice for the family because that was the husband's favorite dish. And you know, the daughter who's our guest, you know, she kept on telling to the daughter, like, you have to learn your dish, you have to learn your dish. And she's like, yeah, no worry, Mom, I'll learn it. And then 2 years ago, her mother passes away. So for her, it was her desire to learn her family recipe again, so to speak. So in our episode, we're gonna talk about how her mom did it, and we're gonna travel to Puerto Rico and find out how they do it out there, and then learn about what's the difference and like how culture evolves. And for her, she's gonna find her own way and find her own style of ganduli rice and how she's gonna feed her family with that dish. So I don't know, we wrestle with a bunch of those things and try to make it easier for audiences to hear our stories. So yeah, basically it.
So I'll just talk about 2 ways that ethnic studies has informed the work I do, and then an example of that. So the first is, you know, kind of like what I was saying earlier, that using our privilege as occupying positions within the academy, it's essential for us to use that in partnership with community building and people who are located outside of the academy to engage in collective action to challenge systems of power. And so that to me is a really critical part of the history of how ethnic studies came to be and why it's still really important and relevant. And in particular, you know, challenging capitalism in the way that it unfolded here in Hawaii, particularly in terms of the wave of corporate-driven development that evicted families of various ethnic backgrounds, as well as Kanaka, Oiwi, off of lands in order to make way for large suburban and urban developments. And to me, that is not something that's changing, and in many ways, it's continued just as quickly and if not quicker than it was happening then. So that continues to remain, for me, a really relevant and important legacy of ethnic studies. And then also the challenge that ethnic studies poses to white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, colonialism, imperialism, and you know, the work, for example, that Dean has done, and building also on the work that Andy Smith has done around 3 pillars of white supremacy, has been really informative for me to think about how that works in relation to my own training in Hawaiian studies, Native studies, Indigenous studies, how we need to be mindful of how to articulate and wage our struggles while thinking about how we may at the same time be complicit in the oppression of other peoples, and then how to organize differently. So that's been really important for me. So one example that I've tried to kind of blend that is to work with some other folks who are here in the audience, Ilima Long and Noel Peralta, who are currently grad students in political science, as well as Tina Grandinetti and Andre Perez also helped collaborate on creating this curriculum called Movement Building for EA. And it's a curriculum that we created not to use in university settings, but really to take out into communities. And it was, I think, in many ways inspired by the legacy of, what ethnic studies students did with communities like the Waihole Waikane Community Association, which is not to say that we have the answers, but here are some tools that come out of our training that we'd like to share when invited in by a community to share knowledges about how we can work together. So, for example, in that curriculum, one of the stories that we draw upon is the story of a student organization that formed here on this campus called Make'epono Lahui Hawaii, that was fighting to end all forms of oppression and colonialism against Native Hawaiians of any sort on the campus. So they had a really wonderful and big vision, and one piece of that was that they fought to have a Hawaiian language column untranslated in the student-run newspaper here. So we use that story as a way to kind of open talking about how to build a campaign, but then we also try to bring in the work on 3 pillars of white supremacy to think about and get people engaged in talking about different situations that people might find themselves in when organizing for different kinds of spaces, whether it's the discursive space or actual land space, or the various kinds of ways that people who have been marginalized and tossed aside have been denied, epistemic space, all of those kinds of things. So that's, one example.
So in thinking about how to answer this question, I thought I would just use a visual. And it's one that I'm sure many of you have seen. It's been used a lot in a lot of the different documentaries. So Act of War uses it. Kealakeli's Noho Hewa, the wrongful occupation of Hawaii, uses it. I used this political cartoon for my first day of class. And it's kind of an attempt to bring brevity, lightness to some of the topics that I cover in the class. And so I guess one way to kind of start talking about this is that when I was an undergraduate student and I was taking ethnic studies classes and also classes at the Center for Hawaiian Studies, I began to try to think how to place all of these histories in relationship to each other. I started to really try to struggle and wrestle with what does it mean to be non-Hawaiian on Hawaiian land? What does it mean to live in an occupied Hawaii? What does it mean to have your own histories of imperialism and resistance to imperialism? And what are those histories, and how do you make those histories, how do you activate those histories so that it can potentially be relevant to your peers, to your community? And right around the time I graduated from ethnic studies, it was also the time that Candice Fujikane and Jonathan Okumura edited Amerasia, the Amerasia Journal, whose vision agent settler colonialism in Hawaii. And so that was sort of the initial kind of impetus for my work, why I wanted to go to graduate school. I remember reading Haunani Kitras, Settlers of Color and Immigrant Hegemony, and really having just this moment of contending with the arguments that she was making and having a difficult time doing so, And so I guess I continued doing that kind of work in graduate school and University of Michigan and whatnot. And so I guess I would just use this image to talk a little bit about the 3 heteropatriarchy and the 3 pillars of white supremacy. And I think it's a model that tries to get us to do relational thinking as opposed to comparative thinking. So instead of the comparative, this is this history, that is that history, it's saying, okay, if we know that this is what happened here, that is what happened here, how do they relate to each other? And so I usually have my class at the beginning. I have about 80 students. It's an introductory Asian/Pacific/American class, American cultures class. It's a difficult class to teach because there's so much history to cover. But I think it's strategically useful in a place like Manhattan or Mannahatta, where the narrative, the dominant narrative is immigration. It's like this kind of melting pot of immigration. But Lenape history is never talked about. I always tell my students, so we can look at the Statue of Liberty and they're welcoming immigrants, but we never look at the history of relocation of the Lenape. So they're welcoming immigrants at the same time that they're relocating the indigenous peoples of Manhattan. And so I try to get them to think about this, and so this image to me is really useful. I have them talk to each other. Usually the first day of class, they don't really want to meet me, they want to meet each other. And so it's kind of useful, and they tend to have a lot to say. And so a part of it is thinking through the 3 pillars of white supremacy. This is an image that comes out of the magazine Puck. Comes out on January 25th, 1899. This is 1 week before the start of the Philippine-American War. And recent research by Dylan Rodriguez talks about the numbers of the Philippine-American War, the casualties. Previously, it was thought to be 500,000, 800,000, 1 million. Dylan argues that it's 2 million. Upwards of 2 million Filipinos were killed during the Philippine-American War so that the Americans could teach democracy to Filipinos. And so this cartoon, it's discursive, it's artistic, but it has a material impact on Filipinos, right? So like I want them to start thinking about the material impact of images, of language, of words, etc. So Annie Smith is sort of making an intervention in dominant models of organizing. So instead of the common model, which is let's organize around our shared victimization, she's saying that maybe instead what we need to question or ask is how power is not operating uniformly on all of our communities, how we have these distinct, yet at the same time interconnected histories, right? Sometimes so we can think about these histories as power and oppression as being overlapping, right? It's impacting all of us, but we're not all being impacted the same. So these are overlapping oppressions, but they're not equivalent. And so she makes an argument and thinks about 3 pillars. She makes the argument that there should be more, there probably are more, but this is a strategic assemblage, right? She's strategically assembling these different histories, movements, and fields. And so for me, ethnic studies was incredibly useful for me in terms of thinking through, for instance, so one pillar is slavery, where race works in such a way that it constructs certain populations as slaveable. And so Hawaii's history of sugar plantations, pineapple plantations, the current so-called service industry, all of these different kinds of things create a certain kind of racial construct that makes certain people slaveable. And then another logic that she talks about is Orientalism or war, right? Where there needs to be a permanent foreign threat that allows the United States to be in a permanent state of war. Sora Han is oftentimes quoted. Sora Han has this one quote where she said, "The United States is not a nation at war. The United States is war." And so how do we think about the United States and forms of militarism so that there's this kind of always this way in which the United States is militarily fortifying itself? And so obviously Hawaii is a perfect example of this kind of, that kind of process. And then the other thing that she talks about is genocide or settler colonialism. Okay, so here you have the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, right, being lectured to by Uncle Sam. But you also have California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. Alaska is interesting and very interestingly racialized, but you have them as the kind of studious, orderly territories who are organized and at the same time racialized as white. Right? So there are indigenous populations that exist here, there are indigenous sovereignties that exist there, but at the same time that process of settler colonialism works in such a way where the indigenous has to disappear so that others can lay a claim to their land. And so what she's saying is if we think about these different logics, right, as separate and distinct but interrelated, where they're different but structured in complex unity, there's so many different ways of thinking through this. I actually find that a lot of students from islands have a really easier time picking up this material. And so, anyway, I think what she's saying and what has been helpful for me is thinking about what a settler of color critique of empire looks like. And that it has to engage with white supremacy, these structures of white supremacy. So to only think about it in terms of settler colonialism may get us so far. But if we also attach intersectional analyses such as labor exploitation, such as militarism, then we're bringing in these different kinds of histories and we're activating these histories in a way that gives us the kind of nuance, that gives us the kind of specificity that we need to ask the difficult questions of ourselves. So in other words, it's not to just ask, how am I oppressed, but it's to also, or how do we organize around shared victimization, but also to organize around where we are complicit in the victimization of others. So I've been using this political cartoon. I was also thinking of maybe even talking a little bit, when I was a graduate student at University of Michigan, I don't know if Vince, Tina, or Damon remember this, but graduate students use this image to also talk about the power dynamics of our department. And so graduate students put Uncle Sam as American Studies, and then we put APA Studies, Latino Studies, Asian American Studies, etc. But we were using it as a way to kind of think about the spatial violence of paternalism within the university setting.